So have any of you read some Plato before? Are you familiar at all with the Allegory of the Cave or the story or the Republic? No, nobody? Has anybody at least heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
have.
I've never read it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I would be pretty shocked if absolutely no one in this class had at least in some liminal way been familiar with the story, because it is a kind of architectonic myth that is a foundational myth by which we understand ourselves, even to the present moment. And you might see some affinities or some parallels with the sort of thought experiment leveraged by Plato here with respect to Cartesian dualism, right? So there are some affinities or connections to be made there. And there's a whole lot that one can do with the rich substance of this allegory, of this myth. So we can take it in a variety of directions, having to do with education, what it means to learn things, what it means to acquire knowledge, social justice issues, coming to terms with the basic intelligibility of reality, what it means to be real. So all these things, but really we're going to focus on Plato's doctrine of truth that we might take out of this. Truth as both an important concept in terms of metaphysics, that is reality, so relating this idea of truth to what is real or what is most eminently knowable, and then knowledge, obviously. So as we learned from the very beginning of this class, when we first engaged with Plato in his dialogue, the Apology, knowledge is always of the true. Knowledge is always of truth, whereas opinion or belief can be true or false, right? And so we're going to be really, in a rigorous way, refining our understanding that we've already begun with from that orientation at the start. Okay, and so let me, before I forget, oh, there's something in the chat. Oh, okay, so Malika, you said they went over the allegory in high school, but not very well. Yeah, I hear that a lot. So this is a really important allegory, and we're going to take it very seriously and respect it for what it has to offer us. And some philosophers in particular, and I'll share a diagram, a kind of schematic from this figure, but a contemporary thinker, Pierre Grimes, has made a compelling case that Platonism, this kind of Platonic metaphysical system, is really an important spiritual and wisdom tradition that ought to be perceived on par with, say, Buddhism or Hinduism and so forth. But unfortunately, it's sort of been relegated to the dry and largely inaccessible purview of academic scholarship, right? But there's something really rich and important for us as thinkers, and not just as thinkers, but as beers, whose being to a large extent involves thinking, right? And so we'll be talking quite a bit about that. But let me turn to the attendance to get that sorted out. So I'll just call your name and just give me a shout out so I know that you're here. And then so we're all on the same page, because I'm not so naive to think that all of you were able to do the reading before class today. Let's see, we will watch a video, a short video, kind of a trippy bit of animation, I think from the 70s or 80s. It's actually narrated by Orson Welles. It's really cool, in the Allegory of the Cave. So we'll do that after I work through the attendance real quick. All right, Shannon.
I'm here.
Okay, Michael Balbuena. Alanis.
I'm here.
Elena.
Here.
Shane. Kevin. Nancy?
Here.
Okay. Renee Croft.
I'm here.
Nicholas. Myra. Victoria. Jotty.
Here.
Spencer. Max. Renee Lockery. Is Renee Lockery here? Ale. Alejandra. Okay. Madeline. Blake.
Here.
Kayla.
Here.
Malika.
Here.
Robert.
Here.
Michael Sacho. Karina.
Here.
Charles.
Here.
Dylan. Hannah. Shay.
Here.
Patrick. Danny. All right. Okay, so before we watch this video, though, and I'm not going to put us into breakout rooms for this. We have a small enough group. I'd like to just have a full class discussion on this, but to a large extent, you might say that this allegory tracks the difficulties and struggles that one encounters invariably in moving from an unenlightened state to an enlightened one. And it's not, of course, a given that that transition will occur, or that it's a kind of necessity or inevitability. Often we remain in benighted conditions or obscure or conditions of ignorance for our entire lives from this kind of Platonic perspective. But so enlightenment, and that's a word that's, you know, kind of a big and heavy word that has various associations, connotations, and so forth. Oh, okay, Renee Lockery, you're here. All right, yeah, so I'll adjust. Thanks for letting me know. I'll adjust the attendance in a moment. But so it's a word with which we're all familiar. You've all heard of enlightenment, or being enlightened, or as a condition of one's being. So you can be an enlightened person, for example, or unenlightened, but also we use that descriptive language to account for attitudes or beliefs. So someone can have, for example, an enlightened or an unenlightened worldview or understanding of things. But I wonder, since it's a fairly familiar concept, but it is rather obscure, what you guys make of it. So just in terms of your own experience, your own thinking, your own exposure to different problems or questions in your lives, what do you guys think about enlightenment? Like, what does it mean to be enlightened? And you might make connections in how you respond to this, to the reading, to the text. But yeah, Renee, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the base of enlightenment, like what the term means, is to have something revealed to you, like light is being shed on a subject. But it's, at least in my experience with people who've talked about being enlightened or enlightening other people, it's very subjective, because it always comes from a place of, oh, this is my truth that I'm telling you. Like it it's never one identifiable thing that you can go, oh yes, that's right, that's correct. It's one person kind of giving their 2 cents and saying, oh, I'm smart and I'm better because I know this thing that I don't think you know, but now I'm going to tell you about it. So it's always seemed something that, at least in terms of anyone who says that they are that, kind of pretentious. Just
Good, good. So there's a lot to what you just said. So anyone who's been on social media, especially over the last couple of years, with all of this profound upheaval and confusion and so forth, you might encounter people who claim to have the truth or claim to be, a term that I encounter quite often is intuitive. Right? So I'm very intuitive. That's how I know what's going on. But all of you who aren't so lucky to be endowed with this powerful intuition, you're all susceptible to, propaganda or something. So someone might claim to have unique access to the truth through something like intuition, and on that basis they achieve or can self-describe as enlightened or being enlightened or having enlightenment or something like that. And then that's usually, though, when it's pretentious, as you said, off-putting in that way, it's usually about facts, right? So I'm enlightened because I have this unique intuitional access to truths of the world to which perhaps all of you do not have access. And what I mean by that, these truths of the world are facts. So for example, someone who thinks that it's that the pandemic is a plandemic, right? That it's all just some sort of, it's all just some instrument of manipulation and control or something like that. And they have access to this knowledge because they're familiar with certain truths. But if you ask them questions about what these truths are, they might share with you superficial memes or disjointed news reports from questionable sources. And so they're all about facts. Facts are supposed to be empirically determinate states of affair that are found through verification to be true rather than false. Now, we'll gain some deeper understanding philosophically as to what a fact is, what it means to be a fact next week when we return to David Hume. But what we can draw from Plato today is, and this speaks to what real enlightenment is in accordance with this tradition, it's not a more or less detailed and sufficiently representative series of facts that we can unpack about the world, but truth is rather, from this Platonic orientation, as we'll see, the very source of factuality. And as such, it remains as truth inexhaustible. So any fact that we uncover about a particular situation, then, from this way of understanding it, would simply be understood, however verified as correct for the moment of our experience, would be understood as an invitation for further inquiry, right? So truth is that which underlies the possibility of any determinate fact arising and presenting itself as such, is really a kind of goad or an incitation towards the truth, and also a normative mark or a kind of evaluatory mark by which we can distinguish the truth from the false at any particular moment. So truth is, as Renee was putting it, I think earlier, just a few minutes ago, is about disclosure. So when you are enlightened, the idea goes, something has been revealed or something has been disclosed to you that was previously obscure. And so light is important for that, as you mentioned. So there's a dark space in which it is uncertain, it is entirely indeterminate, or essentially undecidable as to what stands forth in presence in that space. And it's only once the field or the domain or the space has been illuminated that objects can present themselves as what they are. and on that basis can be recognized, right? So we're also then bringing up this concept of recognition, making an important point of connection from last week in our discussion of Hegel to now. So personal identity, for a healthy, flourishing sense of self, that is a self that's undergirded by, in Russin's language, drawing on Lang, ontological security, where you're very certain of your being. And on the basis of that self-certainty, you're able to deploy your actions meaningfully into the world and do things that matter, do things that make a difference. Well, to do that, you need to be recognized, right? You need to be given equal recognition with others. And you also need to be able to facilitate, for your own part, a relationality to the world and others that populate that world of equality as well. But to recognize another person as the kind of person that they demand to be seen as means first that that person has to stand forth in their very essential presence by which they can be encountered, right? So to be able to recognize another individual as the person they are and demand to be seen as, or to be able to recognize any object that you can come upon in your everyday experience as something. So if you walk into a darkened room, you turn on a light, you notice a chair in the corner of the room, without even thinking it explicitly, you just recognize that there's a chair over here, there's a desk over there. Well, that moment is a moment of decision in which you're able to say, that is a chair. You perceive this object that presents itself as something. That is to say, it is intelligible, it means something. It's not just a chaotic, discordant jumble of materiality that confuses you, right? The very moment you perceive the object, you perceive it as what it is. In other words, you recognize it. But what are the conditions necessary for that recognition? Well, Renee already mentioned it before in connection to the question of enlightenment, right? Light. There has to be light to illuminate the space, to allow the very relation from self to other of recognition to take root. So does that make sense so far? So then when we talk about enlightenment, we can move away then, in the at least the Platonic context of enlightenment, from thinking of someone who maybe is characterized as enlightened as someone who has all the facts, as known objects, but it's instead someone who has come to recognize the very space, the illuminated space in which anything can show up as a fact in the very first place, right? So it's more about seeing things, ways of seeing things accurately, rather than the things themselves as pinned down or clearly articulated through one definition or another. But Renee, yeah, you wanted to add something, or?
Just the isn't this that word that you were talking about really early on, like the Greek one, the aletheia word?
Good.
Isn't that what this means?
Yeah,
Okay.
precisely. So remember the Greek sense of truth. And by the way, as a historical aside, we can trace the epistemic adventure, you might call it, of our very understanding of truth from the ancient Greek conception of aletheia through the Latin translation of that in Roman philosophy and medieval philosophy too, the primary language of which for the communication and development of science was Latin, well into the 17th century, but the Latin translation of aletheia is veritas. And then from veritas, for example, in English, we get truth, right? So there's this kind of lineage that takes place. But by the time the Latin translation had occurred from aletheia to veritas, an important essential transformation had taken place with respect to this essential epistemic concept of truth itself, such that we moved away from truth as revealing or unconcealment or disclosing to a sense of truth as essentially correctness, or adequation or correspondence, right? So now, for example, maybe the dominant theory of what truth is known in philosophical literature as the correspondence theory of truth. So for example, well, the correspondence theory of truth suggests that truth is a property or a quality that attaches to propositions, or in other words, sentences within a particular language. So the sentence, "The book is on the table," that is an object as a proposition or a sentence which can bear the quality of true or false. It's either a true sentence or a false sentence. So if it's true, then that means the substance or the sense of the proposition or sentence accurately corresponds to some state of affairs out there in the world. So we'll say the book is on the table is true only insofar as, by verification through my 5 senses, or one or more of those 5 senses, that turns out to be the case, right? So it's an accurate description of the state of affairs. In other words, the sentence, "The book is on the table," which can be verbalized or written, corresponds to some determinate state of affairs out there in the world. Now, this transformation in the essential concept of truth really occurs in the heart of the doctrine that Plato gives us through the story of the cave, right? So, for example, you come close to the truth of, let's say, what a tree is. When you find, and this is to use the language and the imagery of the cave allegory. So you come closer to the truth of what a tree is when you realize that a tree is something more than is given in the negative image of its shadow. So right in the bottom of the cave, and we'll turn to the video in just a second for those who have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you did the reading, this should make sense. So at the bottom of the cave, you have these unfortunate cave dwellers who are incapable of any sort of movement, and behind them there's a raised walkway along which various statues or puppets, in short, copies or representations of legitimate or real phenomena out there in the world, are are carried forth. And so you might see the shadow cast against the cave wall of a tree and think you understand what a tree is. But your understanding in terms of what makes this very phenomenon intelligible as a tree, right? Your ability to recognize it as a tree is expanded and rendered more accurate once you're able to see that the negative image as the shadow corresponds in some systematically consistent way with the statue of the tree, of which it is in some measure a copy or a representation. And then you're able to gain even clearer intelligibility in terms of your recognition of what makes a tree when you realize that the statue, for its part, like the shadow is with respect to the statue for its part is a more or less imperfect or incomplete copy of the being of the tree, as, to use this language, a flesh and blood living entity which can take root in the soil and grow in its desire for the rays of the sun, for nourishment, and so forth. There is a correspondence then between the shadow and the statue of the tree, and then the statue and the actual tree itself, which is taking root in the earth and moving upwards towards the heavens. And so that's where the correspondence theory of truth comes about historically. But then, of course, to be able to recognize that correspondence, to be able to make the dialectical connection at each level between copy and model, there very first of all, as the originary condition, has to be the opening up of the space in which that correspondence can even be achieved, right? So for you to be able to make an accurate correspondence, let's say a true correspondence between the model and the tree, or we can say a painting. So you can do a two-dimensional representation of a tree through a painting. To be able to say that this painting is an accurate image, a kind of accurate representation of this real tree of a three-dimensional character that I can encounter and touch and experience in a variety of ways out there in the world, there first of all has to be the space of revelation in which painting, that is copy, and tree, that is model, can be opened up and put into a thematic relationship in the first place, right? So does that make some kind of sense? Or have I lost you guys? So to put it simply again, to be able to say that the copy of something, like a painting of a tree, corresponds to this other thing, the tree out there in the world, there first of all has to be the space in which these objects or entities or phenomena can even come to presence in the first place as a necessary condition for the very possibility of recognizing a correspondence in the first place. And it's that revelation or opening up of the space of intelligibility in which alone you as thinking consciousness can recognize a being as the being that it is. Well, that very space of opening and disclosure, of illumination, is truth from the Platonic point of view. Okay, so are there any quick questions about that? And then we'll watch this brief video. But does that make sense? Are there any questions about that?
That makes sense to me. I've been having kind of that thought for a few days and trying to figure out how to articulate it, and you did it very well. Thank you.
Oh, great, great. And that connects, by the way, to this concept of the idea, which we still use, obviously. It's a common everyday word that we don't even give a second thought to because everyone knows what it means, right? Idea. I have a great idea, or that's a terrible idea. Or we even, so in terms of suggestions for things, or just basic thoughts or images that we conjure up of something at will. So I can have a memory of my breakfast that I consumed this morning, and that'll appear to me in the form of an idea. And so there are so many things that we can define or articulate in the terms of idea that it borders on meaninglessness almost. And this is a problem that really plagued medieval and early modern thinkers and set the stage for a lot of the problems that Hume would attempt to grapple with and dissolve. And so we'll see that trajectory unfold next week when we return to Hume. And we'll work through a few other early modern philosophers, such as John Locke again, and Bishop George Berkeley, to see what they're doing with this notion of idea. But idea, which is the English translation of the Greek word ideia, which if you don't use the Greek text, the Greek vocabulary, if you use the transliteration, well, it looks exactly like the English word. It's just pronounced differently. So ideia versus idea. And so ideia is connected also to this word eidos, which usually gets translated in English to form. Idea and eidos, they both share the etymological beginning of id from Proto-Indo-European language, and it really reflects the visual modality of sense experience. So that which can be seen, that which shows itself. And so just think about the connection then between all of these concepts: light, seeing, things seen or object seen, recognition, space that is lit up through the light in which things can show up as seeable. Well, Plato has all of this in mind. And both ideia and eidos, prior to Plato's dramatic philosophical transfiguration of these terms, well, these words, ideia and eidos, were more or less ordinary pieces of Greek vocabulary, which meant kind of the immediately or the immediate outwardly visible aspect of a thing, in accordance with which you recognize it in terms of what it is. So when you do walk into a dark room, you turn the light on, you notice there's a chair in the corner. Well, that moment of apprehension, when you recognize the object as a chair, you have somehow picked up on its eidos, or you might say its idea, that by which it presents itself as a chair. Or if you're walking in Ashland down the street, several blocks away, you see a human figure approaching. Well, at that stage of perception, you have recognized this object before you as a human, right? So at that point, you have somehow attuned yourself to the eidos of humanness by which you can recognize this person. But then as you get closer, you think, oh, that's my friend Maria. So you recognize her. Well, now you have recognized the unique eidos by which Maria is perceptible or recognizable versus any other human that you might know. But the dramatic intervention that Plato puts to work with respect to the transformation of this everyday term is such that no longer is the eidos of a given thing the sensibly particular outward manifestation of it, but it's that, and this is where the word idea comes in here, but it's that conception of the thing such that the very physical object before you is prepared in such a way that you don't first see it as, oh, that's a physical object, that's a material object. You see the chair, you see the person, right? So there's a sense in which the idea of chairness, the idea of personness, of what it means to be a human, just like light, for example, which illuminates a space, allowing you to perceive the various objects and to discriminate between them, that's always already there before you even make the encounter, right? So we never think about light, for example, as a determinate object that's available for our experience. It rather, in its presence, in its functioning as light, it withdraws, it hides behind the very presences that it illuminates, that it makes available for us, right? So the light that allows me to recognize the chair in the corner of my room as a chair withdraws, as it were, behind the chair, such that I'm not looking at the light. I'm looking at the chair, and I rarely even think about the light. And so that's really what these ideas are doing. The idea of chairness is like this field of illumination, which allows you to recognize the physical entity as a chair, even if, by the way, it's a sort of chair that you've never even seen before or thought about, right? So it could be some wild, completely innovative chair that some talented artist or engineer created that you had never even conceived of or thought possible. But in any case, you would be able, without any effort, to recognize it as a chair, right? And that's remarkable because we're talking about something that you've never seen before. And so this description that I'm giving you is kind of setting the stage for Plato's theory of the forms, which again, form in English gets translated from eidos, which has this important etymological connection to idea, an idea, as I was putting it. So think of your idea of a chair. Well, that idea is fixed in your consciousness as a very field of illumination that makes possible your recognition of the thing chair before you encounter it. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense, but are there any questions about that? All right, so let's watch this video for those of you who weren't able to do the reading, but the reading is very short. So again, this is just an excerpt from one of the books of the Republic. So Republic is one of Plato's middle dialogues, and it's made up of 10 books. And this is the 7th book, and it's understood to be the heart of the text by many scholars. And it really comes on the heels of an important kind of analogy that Socrates, the main character or interlocutor in this dialogue, offers at the end of book 6. And this is an analogy known as the divided line. And so we'll take a look at that. And it's really important. It's in the divided line analogy that Socrates actually sets up for us the essential structure of this metaphysical and epistemological model, which is the structure, as we've touched on already, of the relationship between model and copy, or original and representation. Okay, so, oops, can't do that. Let me share the screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see this. All right, so this is about 8 minutes or so.
Let me show in a parable to what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around. Above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. They see only their own shadows, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. For how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised way, and a low wall built along the way like the screen which puppet players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of articles which they hold projected above the wall? Statues of men and animals made of wood and stone and various materials? Of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? And suppose further that there was an echo which came from the wall. Would they not be sure to think, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice came from the passing shadows? To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if one of the prisoners is released. At first, when he is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his head round and look towards the light, all this would hurt him, and he would be much too dazzled to see distinctly those things whose shadows he had seen before. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. But that now, when he's approaching nearer to reality and his eyes turn toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not think that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. he will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. At first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the stars and the spangled heavens, and the light of the moon. He will see the sky and the stars by night. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of it in the water, but he will see the sun in its own proper place, and not in another. And he will contemplate the sun as it is. Will he not then proceed to argue that it is the sun who gives the season and the years, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which his fellows have been accustomed to behold? Clearly he would first see the sun, and then reason about it. And when he remembered his old habitation and what was the wisdom of the cave and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would bless himself for the change and pity them? And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were the quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, "Better to be the poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything rather than think as they do, and live after their manner"? Imagine once more such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? And if there were a contest of measuring the shadows, and he had to compete with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, wouldn't they all laugh at him and say he had spoiled his eyesight by going up there, and that it was better not to even think of ascending? And if anyone tried to release another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. It is the task of the enlightened not only to ascend to learning and to see the good, but to be willing to descend again to those prisoners and to share their troubles and their honors, whether they are worth having or not. And this they must do, even with the prospect of death. They shall give of their help to one another, wherever each class is able to help the community.
All right. So before we take a break, what are your thoughts on that? So perhaps you didn't do the reading, but now having seen this little animation depicting the allegory, does anything stand out to you? Anything you want to ask about or comment on? Did something in particular seem important from that allegory in terms of the questions we're asking?
I mean, for me, I definitely see the reference to the very first reading we did on Plato's Apology. And I think I was a little confused when you were explaining it, and I'll be honest, I didn't do the reading, but after watching that video, I see what you mean at this point.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so can you speak a little more, or maybe somebody else, about the connection between the apology and this allegory? Yeah, Renee, go ahead.
I could see, well, I didn't make any connections before, but I did. This is my second time seeing the video now, where the people in the cave want to persecute the person or kill them that comes back after having the truth revealed to them, and just because they don't like or believe that that's the truth, like what was happening in the apology, just because it's shaking things up, they don't like it, it's upsetting them. Well, obviously we have to kill this guy. So I think that's definitely the parallel.
Good, yeah. Yeah, so poor Socrates in real life, as a matter of historical significance, reached that terrible end, right? So he was put to death, you might say, by suggesting and not even attempting within the context of the court, not attempting to bring those out of the darkness of the cave, but simply suggesting that they were in darkness in the first place. So that suggestion was enough to, of course, as we've seen, inspire the ire and aggression of those prominent Athenians. But yeah, so that's an important connection. But you might then say, to make another connection, that there is a kind of politics to the cave, and it's a politics grounded in images and image making, right? So what was Socrates doing as a philosopher, practicing the examined life, as he put it? Well, maybe Karina has something to add to that. Yeah, go ahead, Karina.
I think that it is sort of, to me, the main message that I get from the cave is that growth and learning and expanding your worldview is kind of a painful process, but it's very much worth it. But I also think that there is kind of like danger presented here as well, in that the belief that because I have learned all of this from going out of the cave and from seeing the world, I am inherently better than those who are in the cave. But those who are in the cave are doing the best with the knowledge that they have. They can't make any other conclusions. And one of the reasons that they're in the cave, wouldn't it be better to say, like, hey, let's not put more people in caves. Let's instead just have everyone out on the surface, and teach them that to begin with. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but I think there is something to be said for considering the institutions that are leading to this lack of philosophical knowledge and of any knowledge. I don't know. There's just kind of a danger in pretentiousness, I think.
Yeah, but so that's an important point, and Socrates and Plato have been criticized for what certain scholars object to as a kind of moral intellectualism. So one of Socrates' most
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, one of his most famous contributions, which is perhaps distinguishable from Plato's more robust and familiar philosophical doctrine, is that all, and we kind of touched on this in the context of the Apology, is that all evil, badness, or wrongdoing is a consequence of ignorance. And so those who are ignorant then would be seen to be bad. And that can be, politically or in terms of a socially just way of perceiving the human world and of recognizing and working against human problems, deeply historically entrenched problems, that would perhaps be seen as elitist and victim blaming or something like that, right? So that's a fair point. But I want to suggest, though, that we have to pay very close attention to what's going on in the allegory. Because remember, the one who is ultimately liberated, who is able to escape the bounds of the cave, nevertheless must return, is compelled to return. And in fact, and this isn't entirely obvious given the subtleties of the imagery that Plato gives us with the allegory, our very world, the world that we recognize as the outside world, as reality itself, is within the cave, right? So that's where we are. That is to say that no human has directly experienced ultimate truth as represented by, within the scope of the story, what would be outside the cave. So all of our lives, including the most enlightened, which would include then Socrates, Plato, and other such thinkers, never have escaped the cave, right? They're in the cave. And so they, in terms of putting their wisdom to work for the purposes of universal human freedom, cannot ever hope to take anyone out of the cave either. So it's not as if we should think of these philosophers as, oh, they're the ones who are free from the cave, and all of us poor suckers are stuck within it, because whoever achieves even an inkling of, even a minimal approximation towards enlightenment, towards the full truth, has to do so haphazardly and imperfectly from within the horizon of the cave world. And so, and I kind of point to this in the schematic that I provided you guys. What ultimately happens in the final stage of liberation, when the escapee returns to the cave, is that person is only able to disclose what is hidden within the bounds of the darkness, that is, what is untrue, as hidden, as untrue. So it's not as if the individual who returns to the cave has some momentous flashlight or something that they can use to illuminate everything. They can only say, look, we are in a cave. But for the prisoners who never left, it's not a cave. And they're not looking at shadows. It's in fact reality. And the shadows are beings. And so all that the enlightened one can do is show that we are in conditions of darkness, that we are in conditions of obscurity. And that's to illuminate the insuperable condition of human finitude, right? And so that's another connection to make to the Apology, where, remember, to, in any final and satisfying sense, fight against the dangers of rhetoric, because remember, as a mode of discourse, rhetoric operates politically by revealing some things, but keeping others concealed, keeping others hidden. And in fact, keeping that very concealment or hiddenness as a true condition hidden too, so that it's not concealed, it's simply the way things are. It's not obscure or confused, it's simply the real world. Well, dialectic, which is the primary mode of discourse associated with philosophy, and we've looked at dialectic through a few openings, that is the Socratic one from the beginning, and now Hegel's dialectic from last week, operates by bringing to light or bringing to a state of illumination what was previously obscured. But it's not as if that's a task that can never be won or completely achieved, because the moment we reveal some phenomenon and illuminate the truth or bring to the presence of truth some state of affairs, we are effectively obscuring something else, right? So there's always going to be some liminal obscure background or blind spot, you might say, of bias or prejudice that we have to confront at some point in this task towards the truth. But it's a task that is ongoing, that you might say marks the very being of what it means to be human. And so this speaks to philosophy as the examined life, as the essential activity by which humans exercise their humanness, as opposed to, for example, on one extreme, the gods, who would not need philosophy because they're standing forth always already within the perfectly illuminated realm of the truth, right? So they don't need philosophy, they don't need to ask questions. Or on the other side, plant life or mineral life, which is just so benighted, so lacking consciousness that there would be no pursuit that's motivated by the desire to learn or understand, right? So the human being is somewhere between these extremes as a kind of in between hybrid being, you might say, suspended between the possibility of perfect knowledge and perfect ignorance. Okay, so does that make sense? So I'm checking the chat. Nancy asked, are these individuals in the cave being punished for something they did, or is it just a metaphor? Well, it's an allegory, which uses metaphor. So an allegory is a story or a narrative, a myth that's supposed to communicate important but obscure truths to us. That is to say, strong, timeless, and metaphysical truths, truths that get to the very heart of reality. And so, if you noticed, at a certain part of the dialogue, Glaucon, with whom Socrates is talking, once, and this is close to the beginning of the story, once Socrates just describes the situation, gives an account of what's going on, Glaucon responds, these are strange figures, right? These are really strange individuals or strange prisoners that you talk about. And what is Socrates' response to that? Does anyone remember? So he responds to Glaucon by pointing out who these prisoners really are. And so who do they turn out to be?
They were like the judges or the jury. I forgot what it was. The Athenians?
No. So I'm talking about a specific exchange between Glaucon and Socrates.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm thinking
Yeah,
of the
that's
wrong
okay.
thing.
So I'll just read the text to you. So this is after he lays out the description. Glaucon says, this is an unusual picture that you are presenting here, and these are unusual prisoners. And by the way, unusual, it's sometimes rendered in English as strange, but the Greek word is atopos, which literally means out of place, unfamiliar. And remember, that's a word that Socrates used to describe himself in his presence in the context of the courtroom, that he was out of place in the kind of context or venue in which rhetoric would be the appropriate mode of discourse, right? And so again, making this connection between those dialogues, we can say that rhetoric as a political discourse would be that through which the various figures, so the prisoners and so forth, communicate with each other, communicate their relation to what they take to be the truth, in terms of laying out the politics of the cave, the very politics of the cave rhetorically deployed, which would bring these prisoners to react violently and aggressively towards those who would want to free them or make the gesture towards liberating them. So going back now to the text, so he says, this is an unusual, an atopos, a strange picture that you are presenting here, and these are strange or unusual prisoners. Socrates says, they're very much like us humans. So they're like us. In fact, they are us, allegorically. They're representing our very human condition. And so that's the suggestion that I floated a moment ago, to the effect that the world or realm of the cave is in fact the world or realm of our everyday familiar experience, right? So then to answer Nancy's question, right, these are not prisoners as those who would be incarcerated for some transgression or some crime, right? They're not being disciplined, they're not being rehabilitated. This is simply where we are. So we are like these prisoners. And so we shouldn't think too much about who those figures are that are keeping us imprisoned, although you might make some social political connections there. or reflections about that. So Karina mentioned earlier the sort of entrenched historical institutions that we inherit as we grow up in the very world of our communities and our milieu that stand because of the norms that effectively construct and sustain these institutions that stand to keep us oppressed or marginalized, or at least those who are not given equal recognition suffer from or are placed in a particular way. So we can make that connection. But just to be clear, we're not dealing with prisoners as you might find being punished for a crime, one or another. These individuals simply represent all of humanity, that is to say, the human condition, which means that insofar as we're all human, in terms of our everyday lives, what it means to exist, nobody has ever experienced the exterior of the very world that we call home. No one has ever been on the outside of the cave.
And it's sort of the same idea as simulation theory, where you don't know, like, you don't know how deep you are in all of this. Like, you could go outside, there's still another cave, and there's another cave after that.
Yeah, in fact, if you think about it, so you ascend the long, difficult floor of the cave to its opening, you're now outside. And we talk about that in terms of being on Earth, right? We're all humans that live on planet Earth. But I think the preposition in is still more appropriate, right? We are in the Earth. And actually, at the end of Plato's, or close to the end of another important middle dialogue of Plato, the Phaedo, at the end of which Socrates in his prison cell is compelled to drink the hemlock and he dies. Well, he gives this myth about how we don't really recognize. So these cave dwellers, they don't know they're in a cave. That's simply the world. And for those who navigate the more familiar Earth, standing on it, seeing the light of the sun and so forth, we think we're outside. But we're actually enveloped, however, within the atmosphere. And so from our finite perspective, standing on the ground of the Earth, enveloped within those various spheres, we don't know that, right? So from our perspective, we think we're on something, when in fact, we are in something. And so there's always this sort of enveloping space which provides a kind of horizon of our experience by which we can locate ourselves within a space and recognize objects as showing up around us and so forth. But yeah, that's an important point. So any other comments or questions about the allegory so far? So I have some slides to pull up. But actually, before I do that, I want to do a little exercise here.
Wait, I have a question.
Sure.
So is it like, I guess the prisoners in that allegory, is it just like saying how like people don't always like are unaware of what's around them, and it's just like focused on one thing and not looking around, or being like not open-minded, I guess?
So yeah, so what are the prisoners in the cave looking at? What are they experiencing? What do they take to be real? So what are they talking about when they talk with each other?
I forgot. Let me look it up. Well, I know they're like they just like look down like to the ground, and they don't really like look
What do
around.
they see? I mean, if you remember the video, what do they see before them on the wall of the cave?
I remember.
Can anyone help out Nancy here?
They were just looking at the shadow puppets.
Shadows, not even the puppets yet, right? That's a later stage in the path towards liberation, which, as we've talked about today, is not necessarily a completable task in the course of an ordinary human life. So they see the shadows on the wall. They take the shadows to actually constitute reality. right? So what does that tell us then? If we're understanding these prisoners as us, and not simply as children, because we are largely infantile, even in adulthood, using this kind of thought experiment here. So what does it mean if we're all prisoners and all we see in terms of real or reality, or what we understand to be the truth of reality, are these shadows?
We're only seeing a small part or an illusion of something that is much bigger.
Right. So what exactly, now we can get into an ontology of shadows. Ontology is a sub-branch of metaphysics, which investigates the nature of existence. So doing an ontology, coming to terms with the existence of shadows. Well, what exactly is a shadow? How can we characterize the isness, if you will, of a shadow? So if you had to explain to someone what a shadow is, what would you say?
The absence of light in a certain place because the light is being blocked by an object or a person.
Good, perfect. So this is really important to understand what's going on in the allegory. So we use language, and this is a limitation to human discourse. We use language to the effect that we present shadows as phenomena, that is, as things which appear as positive presences. So we say, there is a shadow over there. The shadow is. But in reality, the isness of a shadow is negative. The being of a shadow is not a presence, but rather an absence. So think about this. This is kind of an amazing idea to come to terms with. When you're walking down the street in mid-afternoon and you're able to see your long shadow, the shadow of your own body, cast alongside you or in front of you, that very figure, that very object that you recognize as a shadow is the result of waves of light traveling millions and millions of miles, millions and millions of miles, entirely unobstructed, entirely untouched, until it stops at your body. So what you take to be the presence of the shadow of your own body is really just the manifestation of an interruption of the path or traveling of light, right? So that's how important your body is. It alone stopped this traveling of rays of light for millions of miles, right? So shadow, like a hole in the ground, for example, is not a thing. It's not a determinate positive presence to which we can ascribe properties, but it's actually the absence of something. So a shadow then is a negative image. It's an image of a form or of a being, of an entity or an object, but it's a negative image. And so think about light, as we were talking about earlier today. How for something to show up as recognizable in terms of what it is, and its truly positive presence, it has to be illuminated through a field of light, or within, I should say, a field of light. But in this case, we're talking about something that is the result or product of the interruption of that very field of intelligibility, such that something can stand forth as what it is. So think about that in terms of our ordinary human experience. And now I can turn to the whiteboard and do a little exercise with us. So think about this concept, and really what I want to talk about, and we might have to spend some time on this for Thursday, the concept of the good. Right? The good is really important, and the idea or concept of the good should be associated really strongly with the figure of the sun in the allegory. But instead of the good, let's talk about another important concept or idea in human life: beauty. So let's say, text. So let's say a space alien has been observing humans for quite a while. And among the various interesting or significant features that characterize what it means to be human, or the possibility of human experience that these alien beings have picked up on, is that of beauty. So they have noticed through their observations that the notion of beauty, beautiful experiences, beautiful objects, and so forth, that's something really important, but it's confusing to this being. It's puzzling. So let's say this alien talks to you. They come down and they're like, hey, I want to learn about your people. I want to learn about Earth and Earthlings. And I understand that something that's very valuable or important within Earth and life is what you guys call beautiful or beauty. What is that? What does it mean? And now let's say in response, you want to give some examples that you think are illustrative of your own relationship to beauty and the beautiful. What examples would you give? So what are some things that we consider beautiful? Can anyone, so anyone is free to just jump in and throw some suggestions at me. So what are some examples of that which is beautiful, or what we take to be beautiful?
Flowers, the outdoors.
Yeah, let's stay with more specific items. So as opposed to the outdoors, things like flowers, or even more specific. So you could say like a hydrangea or a rose or a lily or something. But what are some other examples?
Things that sparkle like a diamond, or like gems.
Someone other than Renee want to jump in? What do you consider beautiful?
I guess certain artworks.
Okay.
Birds. I don't know specific ones,
Like
but like birds outside.
Okay. What else?
The sky, like more like the clouds.
Okay. What else?
Kind of to add on to that, like sunsets.
All right. Perfect. Other examples?
I tend to find someone's personality as being beautiful.
Okay, good. Oops. What else?
In that vein, people could find their partners physically beautiful.
Okay. Human bodies. So here we're talking, I guess I should say human personalities. What else? Have we exhausted the world of beautiful things already?
Like rivers and oceans.
Okay, let's say the ocean, rivers. What else? So we said artworks. Say paintings or sculpture, right? What about, we could include music in that too, right? So we often consider music or melodies within music to be beautiful, right? Any other examples?
Buildings, trees.
Okay. Like architecture or buildings or like cityscapes. So you might look at, for example, the skyline of New York City or downtown San Francisco or something like that is beautiful. Or what about some people are fond of sports cars, right? So someone might say that like a Maserati or something has beauty or is beautiful. Some people have been known to characterize babies as beautiful. That's another example.
Like stadiums, maybe?
We can just kind of put that in buildings then.
Oh, buildings, okay.
But notice, I mean, we could spend all day increasingly expanding this list, right? So now let's just deal with what we've got though. I'll throw one more thing in there. So if some people have been known to attach aesthetic qualities to abstract math formula, for example, or principles in geometry or formulae in algebra, right? So like a math problem or something, if it's resolved elegantly or something like that, or a particular proof. Or in that vein, scientific theories for their explanatory rigor and elegance have been described in different instances as beautiful, right? So now dealing with this limited list, so let's say you share all of these things with the space alien that's asking you about beauty and the beautiful. So there's like, well, what is beauty? What do you guys mean by that? Why is this so significant? So I want you to explain to me the very concept of beauty. And you're like, okay, so flowers are beautiful, diamonds, music, this math problem, this baby, this woman's body, this guy's face, this cloud, this sunset. Now, far more than clarifying or bringing to some sort of intelligible conclusion for the space alien, you would actually be expanding or proliferating the confusion, right? They would be like, well, these things are so radically different. I have no idea what you're explaining to me. You're simply giving me a series of examples, but you're not telling me what it is that makes them examples, right? So what is the red thread, you might say, the principle of unity that despite all of the differences, superficial or serious, that stand between these various objects, that stand between a bird and a piece of music, between a human personality and the ocean, between a baby and a sports car. What is it, despite these profound differences, what is it that brings them together as the same, that is, as recognizable in different experiential moments as beautiful? That's really what the space alien wants to know. And it's the answer that's given in a satisfying way in response to that question, which will characterize and lay out the being of beauty. In other words, the truth of beauty. Such that even if you had never thought about, for example, a cloud as something that you could characterize as beautiful, you see a particular shape of cloud in the sky, and it immediately, without any real reflection, grips you, and you think, that's beautiful. Well, how does that happen? So you recognize this thing with which you're priorly familiar. Perhaps you've seen clouds before, thought about them in different ways, but never before in the sense of beauty. But now that happens. So this physical entity stands forth for your experience as a cloud, but at the same time, you're able to say that cloud is beautiful, which means you're saying something true about its being. And you're saying something true, given that this is a strange or remarkable experience for you, that you didn't yet relate to previously as true. So it's a sort of aha moment of intuition, such that you can perceive some quality in the cloud that allows you to say, that cloud is beautiful. And that allowance puts you in a position to make an intelligible relationship between the cloud as beautiful and, say, a river as beautiful, or a musical composition as beautiful, and so forth. But notice that there is not some determinate property or quality of the cloud or of the piece of music that is the beauty, right? So you can't look at the cloud and say, oh yeah, there's the property of it being white, there's the property of it being shaped, say, like a horse at this particular moment, there's the property of it being of such and such magnitude or size, and then there's the property of it being beautiful, such that you could pick out that property alongside the others. It's rather an idea that you somehow already possessed, or you were somehow already in connection with, that opened up the very presence of the cloud and showed it to you, disclosed it, revealed it in its truth as, among other recognizable qualities, beautiful, right? So when we're trying to understand what something is in its very being, something like beautiful or justice or goodness or truth, or any number of these other important moral and other such concepts, we don't want examples of them, right? So to speak to an early Platonic dialogue that takes place before the Apology, I think I mentioned this dialogue in the context of the Apology, the Euthyphro, where Socrates is preparing to face the indictment, or to at least learn of the substance of the indictment, what he's being charged with. But he encounters Euthyphro, who claims to be an expert in piety, in all things pious, in holiness, which he defines as what the gods love, right? What the gods approve of universally. But it turns out through a series of questions that Euthyphro doesn't really know as conclusively and accurately what the pious or piety is, to the extent that he thinks he does. And so Socrates asks him at the beginning, well, what is, you claim to be an expert in this thing, and I am, among other charges, being accused of a kind of atheism, or in other words, impiety. So perhaps I can learn from you what the pious is and change my ways. But what does Euthyphro do? What does he say in response? He gives an example. He says, the pious is doing what I'm about to do right now. Go charge even my own father in a court of law for wrongdoing. That's what's pious. And Socrates says, well, that can't work. You're not telling me what piety is. You're giving me an example of it. And why is that not sufficient if you're seeking an explanation of something? So using this context, if this space alien asked you what beauty is, and you said, oh, it's the ocean, or it's this cityscape, or it's this human personality, why is that not a good answer? So what's inadequate about using examples to define something, or to explain what something is?
Because you're not telling the reasoning, you're just giving examples of it.
Yeah, so you're communicating through examples certain properties or qualities or features that a given phenomenon holds, communicates, or exemplifies, that it manifests, you might say. But you're not giving a sense of what that thing or phenomenon is. And so then, going back to piety, the reason that the answer, oh, the pious is doing what I'm doing right now, is it's too narrow as exemplary, because there are presumably many other things that would be considered pious, like prayer at the appropriate time, making due sacrifices to the gods, going to various religious rituals, participating in them, and so forth. Just like if I were to say, oh, what is beauty? Well, sunsets. Well, then if I say the beautiful is what's given exemplarily in the form of a sunset, well, then that closes my recognition or observation off from other possible sources of beauty, right? And I won't be able to recognize them because of my inadequate or reduced or limited conception of what the beautiful amounts to. And so this goes back to what Nancy was asking about earlier. So when you're a child, for example, when you're first attuning yourself to the world, you're familiarizing yourself with reality and with what is true by recourse to these ideas or concepts, such as truth itself, or of goodness, or of beauty, the beautiful, or of just or justice, or fairness or unfairness. Well, we rely upon others, those that we take to be authorities, our parents, for example, or our teachers, and maybe because of their own limited experience, they want to respond to us in our moments of sincere questioning with various examples, right? So when you're trying to figure out what is beauty as a child, and you ask your mother, and your mother has to work 3 jobs, right? And she's kind of tired and doesn't really want to get into a metaphysical discussion, well, she might just give you a knee-jerk answer to shut you up. She might say, oh, well, beauty is, being able to relax in some peace and quiet, right? Now, your mother at that point, in this moment of real, sincere relationality or communication between you, she's not trying to abuse you. This isn't going to be a persistent source of trauma for you. She's not doing anything bad. It's just, from any external observation, a perfectly benign, ordinary experience for you as a child with your mother, where she is, in this moment, communicating something really true and important about the world through the lens, you might say, of her own experience. But using Plato's language from the Allegory, that answer that she gives in a moment of exhaustion, it could have been a different answer depending upon a different time of the week or time of the day in which you as the child were asking her. But that moment, beauty is being able to relax in peace and quiet. Well, that, because you are so malleable in your condition of immaturity, and you are so new in your struggling efforts to make sense of this overwhelming and confusing reality, you will internalize that communication about the nature of beauty, and you will internalize it in such a way that it will affect your basic way of perceiving reality for quite a long time. And you might not even think about it until later in life. You might reflect on that moment and notice that you as the child, having grown up, are brought because of a certain reminder in the course of your everyday reality to consider this relational experience with your mother, but maybe your mother never thinks of it again. It's just so innocuous, so insignificant, right? So meaningless, she won't think of it. Yet what she's done is communicated to you a kind of shadow, right? A kind of shadow of the very fullness of the notion of beauty, which connects in various ways to all sorts of other phenomena that we encounter and have to make sense of and render intelligible as we experience things and recognize ourselves and entities. You have now experienced that in the first order through a kind of shadow, which you will have to repair at some point. And that repairing comes through the course of your experience, where you won't in the end, perhaps, be able to give some conclusive definition. Oh, the beautiful is this, in just a sentence or two. And that's not ultimately what Plato is after here. It's to put us in a position to recognize that the very form of beauty, which we implicitly recognize before we encounter any determinate entity or aspect of our everyday experience in terms that we could qualify or characterize as beautiful, using that adjective, that very form of beauty as an idea, so going back to the Greek notion of idea, has been with us. We've been in contact with it. It's been in our possession, or rather, more accurately, perhaps you could say it possessed us before we're even in a position to recognize something in our experience as beautiful. So does that make sense so far? Okay, so now I want to show, with the little bit of time we have left, just some slides here. So this is an image by the philosopher Pierre Grimes that I talked about. This is a diagram that brings together the metaphysical doctrine that we can pull out of the allegory of the cave, and then also the divided line, analogy from the previous book, so from book 6. But this is actually the figure of the divided plane, which Socrates instructs Glaucon at the end of book 6 to draw in the sand with a stick, right? So this is something that would have been visually depicted for the speakers, for the interlocutors in the dialogue at this point. And so this is at once a metaphysical and an epistemological model. So a model by which to understand what is real, and at the same time, on the other hand, the model by which to understand the various human modes of understanding or states of mind, which at every level appropriately correspond to the dimensions of the real. So in the center, you have this vertical line that distinguishes from the left and the right. On the right, you have modes of understanding or states of mind. So these are the features of human consciousness, which at every level correspond to reality, so objects out in the world. And then with the horizontal line, you get, as the word here suggests, a picture of Platonic metaphysical dualism. So we've already encountered Descartes' dualism or Cartesian dualism. But according to this bifurcation of reality, and it's a kind of metaphysical cut by which one order of being is demarcated from another, we get the so-called visible world, which is the world of opinion, right? It's the world of belief. And that's demarcated from what is above this horizontal line as the intelligible world, the world of true knowledge versus mere opinion. So one kind of provocative upshot of Plato's doctrine here, doctrine of knowledge, truth, and reality, is such that human opinion, human belief, destroys or stands in the way of reason, rather than being a vehicle through which reason is developed and articulated. So going back to the very beginning of today's discussion, where we perhaps are in a place to misguidedly associate enlightenment with this sort of pretentious appeal to possessing all of the facts that others don't have for whatever reason, they don't have access to them. Well, we're not talking about truth by that kind of example. Instead, the individual who claims enlightenment by appealing to all these special facts that nobody else knows, they're really just presenting opinions or beliefs as truth. That is to say, as knowledge. And so then we can see the iterative kind of development from the bottom of this image along this axis to the top as the ascent from the heart of the cave from the very mouth of the cave, the interior of the cave, to the outside, right? So that speaks to the fact, as I presented earlier, that the realm of the cave, the world of the cave, is really what we understand within this diagram to be the visible world, which is the world of our everyday experience that we take to be, and accurately, according to this metaphysical theory, that we take to be real. So the sensuous phenomena of our everyday experience is actually a false world. And that is to say, it's false in the sense of giving us always incomplete negative images of the more positive, abiding reality of the truly existing ideas or forms of things. And so this slide here is important for that. So this gives you a picture of Plato's two-world metaphysics. So on the one side, and this is the world under that horizontal line, right? So just to go back to that very quickly. So the world of appearances is what you find here, and that's the world that's communicated through the imagistic language of the cave. So we have the world of appearances or of sensible particulars. So the phenomena that we're most familiar with in our everyday sensory experience are visible, sensible. So you open up your eyes, you expose yourself to an open world populated by chairs and lamps and dogs and cockroaches and flowers and trees and stars and so forth. Well, all of these are entities that exist within the realm of appearances, sensible particulars. And so we can characterize them in all these different ways. But each entity that exists, that stands forth as recognizable as what it is, corresponds to some deeper reality that abides in an independent way within this aspatial, atemporal domain, which some scholars and commentators have referred to as Plato's heaven, right? So this is the realm of the idea, the realm of the eidos, or forms, which are the realities. So whereas the objects that are visible and sensible, as we understand them in our everyday experience, they correspond to that which is invisible and not available to the senses, but instead available for being grasped or apprehended by the mind. That is to say, they are intelligible rather than sensible. So these things within the particular realm are material, but the forms are immaterial. The objects of the world we know, the physical objects, are both spatial and temporal. So we encounter them at a spatial point and within a particular moment. Whereas the forms that correspond to them are non-spatial and non-temporal. All of the various objects that are available for sensible experience are imperfect, whereas their corresponding forms are perfect. All of the particulars are in a state of becoming, whereas all of the forms are simply being. They are. They participate in the status of is. They're not changing. They are immutable or unchangeable, and that's because they are real. They are not mere appearances. And they stand as the originary cause or model of which the sensible particulars for their part are the secondary effects or copies, right? So real quickly, we can use, and this is a famous work of conceptual art this is from the 1960s by Joseph Kossuth, and it's called 1 and 3 Chairs. And this is to give you a kind of visual depiction of Plato's doctrine of the forms. So for every phenomenon, there are actually 3 objects at work for Plato. And we can map these objects in terms of the role that they play within the allegorical language of the myth of the cave, right? So you've got in the middle here a familiar object that we would recognize immediately as a chair that you can actually sit in. And then on the left of it, you have a photographic, that is to say a two-dimensional representation of that chair. So this gives you, in terms of object A to object B here, the representation in the actual chair, one form of that model or structure of original to copy or model to copy. So then this is the original, and the photograph is a representation or an imitation or a copy of it. So for this imitation or representation to exist, there had to be the original as the cause of the effect of this, right? But notice that this is just one chair among an infinite variety of chairs. Perhaps there are chairs that furniture designers have not yet even conceived of, right? That will await us in the future. So then this chair is a particular example of what a chair can be, is just like the photograph of it is dependent upon the actual chair, this chair is dependent on the form of chairness, which is presented here by Koseth as a kind of dictionary definition, which would explain and accommodate this particular chair, but also be open enough to accommodate and make sense of any possible chair, even those that you've never encountered. And that would be the universal form of chairness, which, unlike this chair, was never invented, right? It didn't come into be at a particular point, and it won't rot and decay. It's universal and timeless. And it's this blueprint or archetype that every maker of chairs appeals to whenever they do the work to bring about the actualization or realization of this particular chair, right? So then what a photographer or an artist does in depicting through a representation of a chair is they're making an imitation. So this photograph, and it would be the same if someone were to do a painting of the chair, this photograph is an imitation of the object. But Plato's insight here is the physical object, what we would take to be a real chair, is for its part an imitation of the form of chairness. Okay. So just like the sunset that you characterize as beautiful is an imitation of the universal form of beauty, which would accommodate that sunset as well as a piece of music you think is beautiful or a work of art or whatever else. Okay, so we're out of time and I've already lost a number of you. But does that make sense so far? Are there any questions or comments before we go? No? All right, so we'll pick up on this a little bit. We'll continue to flesh out this theory, and then we'll transition to James Baldwin's piece, Stranger in the Village. I'm deliberately not making explicit connections because I want you guys to think about applying the insights from Plato's Allegory of the Cave to this particular work by Baldwin to see what we can do with that, bridging the historical gap, as it were, for Thursday. So let me know if you have any questions, but have a good week, and I'll see you guys then.
Thank you.
Thank you.